Heinrich Müller is the ghost of the Third Reich. As the head of the Gestapo, Müller was the ultimate desk-bound killer, overseeing the machinery of the Holocaust from a quiet office in Berlin. While other leaders were making speeches, Müller was filing the paperwork for mass murder. On May 1, 1945, as the Soviet army was blocks away from the Reich Chancellery, Müller was seen for the last time. He refused to join the mass breakout from the bunker, telling Hitler's pilot that he knew exactly what the Russians would do to him. He had no intention of being captured. Then, he simply vanished. For decades, Nazi hunters tracked ghosts in South America and spies in the Soviet Union. No body was ever found. No DNA was ever matched. While his colleagues took cyanide or faced the gallows, Müller became the highest-ranking Nazi to escape history's judgment entirely. To this day, his fate remains the greatest unsolved mystery of the war. Some say he died in a mass grave in Berlin. Others believe he sold his secrets to the highest bidder and lived out his life in comfort. Reinhard Heydrich was the man Hitler called the man with the iron heart. He was the golden boy of the SS, groomed to one day succeed the Führer himself, but he didn't make it to the end of the war. In May 1942, in the occupied city of Prague, two brave resistance fighters trained by the British lay in wait. As Heydrich's open-top Mercedes slowed for a sharp turn, they attacked. A grenade shattered the rear of the car. Heydrich didn't die instantly. He actually stood up, pistol in hand, and tried to chase his attackers before collapsing. The irony of his death is dark. He wasn't killed by the metal of the bomb, but by the luxury of his own car. Shrapnel had driven bits of horsehair and upholstery from the car seats into his body, causing a massive, unstoppable infection. He spent days in a hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness before dying of sepsis. His death sent Hitler into a rage of vengeance, but the Butcher of Prague was gone years before his empire would join him. Heinrich Müller built the SS into a state within a state. By 1945, the man who preached absolute loyalty was trying to save his own skin by negotiating a separate peace with the Allies, an act Hitler saw as the ultimate betrayal. When the war ended, Himmler shaved his mustache, put on an eye patch, and carried the papers of a low-ranking soldier named Heinrich Hitzinger. For days, he wandered through northern Germany, hoping to disappear. But British soldiers at a checkpoint grew suspicious. When he was taken in for interrogation, he eventually removed his eye patch, put on his glasses, and whispered, "I am Heinrich Himmler." During a routine medical exam, a British doctor told Himmler to open his mouth. Himmler saw the end. He bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in a gap in his teeth. Despite the soldier's attempts to induce vomiting, he was dead on the floor within minutes. The man who organized the deaths of millions died on a dusty floor, a nameless prisoner. Wilhelm Keitel, the man who led the German military high command, suffered an even worse fate. He had asked to be executed by a firing squad, to die like a soldier. The Allies refused, wanting to show he was nothing more than a criminal. Keitel climbed the stairs, but again, the trapdoor was too small, and the rope was poorly placed. As he fell, he struck his head on the edge of the platform. He didn't die for 20 minutes. The man who had demanded merciless warfare found none in his final moments. At exactly the halfway point of our story, we reach the epicenter of the collapse. On April 30th, 1945, the world of the Third Reich had shrunk to a few concrete rooms, 50 feet under Berlin. Adolf Hitler knew the end was inevitable. Soviet artillery was shaking the very foundation of his bunker. He had seen the photos of his ally, Benito Mussolini, hanging upside down in a square in Milan, being beaten by a mob. He refused to let that happen to him. After a final meal and a series of cold goodbyes, Hitler entered his private study. The door was closed. A few minutes later, a single gunshot rang out. His followers found him slumped on a blood-soaked sofa. He had taken a cyanide capsule and simultaneously fired a bullet into his temple to ensure there was no mistake. Per his final, desperate instructions, his staff carried his remains into the garden above. Under a rain of Soviet shells, they poured gasoline over him and set the body ablaze. He left the world exactly as he had ruled it, surrounded by fire, rubble, and the smell of death. Joseph Goebbels followed his leader just 24 hours later. For years, he had used the radio to convince Germany that surrender was worse than death. In the final hours, he proved he believed his own lies. He and his wife Magda took a horrific path, poisoning their own 6 children in their sleep, believing they were saving them from a world without National Socialism. Once the children were dead, the couple walked out into the garden, near the spot where Hitler's body was still smoldering, and ended their own lives. Whether it was poison or a gunshot, remains a point of debate, but the result was the same. The man who had poisoned the minds of a nation had finally run out of words. Hermann Göring was the flamboyant head of the Luftwaffe, a man who loved stolen art and custom uniforms. In the courtroom at Nuremberg, he was the only one who seemed to enjoy the spotlight, fighting with the prosecutors until the very end. When the death sentence was handed down, he made one final request: to be shot like a soldier, not hanged like a common thief. When the court denied him, Göring took justice into his own hands. Just 2 hours before he was supposed to walk to the gallows, he was found dead in his cell. He had swallowed a cyanide pill. How he managed to hide it for a year in a high-security prison is a question that still haunts historians. Adolf Eichmann, the man who organized the logistics of the final solution, managed to flee to Argentina. He lived under the name Ricardo Clement for 15 years, working in a car factory and living a quiet suburban life. But in 1960, the Israeli Mossad tracked him down. In a daring operation, they kidnapped him and smuggled him to Israel to stand trial. In 1962, Eichmann became the only person ever executed by the State of Israel. He was hanged, his body cremated, and his ashes scattered at sea. To ensure no nation would ever have a grave for him to haunt, Rudolf Hess met a strange and lonely end. Once Hitler's deputy Führer, Hess famously flew a solo mission to Scotland in 1941, hoping to negotiate peace. He was captured and spent the rest of the war in British custody. At Nuremberg, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. For decades, he was the only inmate in the massive Spandau prison in Berlin, guarded by hundreds of soldiers from 4 different nations. In 1987, at the age of 93, Hess was found dead in a small garden house on the prison grounds. He had used an electrical cord to hang himself. His death remains a flashpoint for conspiracy theories, but for history, it marked the true end of the old guard. Albert Speer was the only one who played a different game. Hitler's architect, the man who used slave labor to keep the German war machine running, admitted guilt at Nuremberg. He played the part of the repentant technocrat, claiming he was just an artist caught up in a political nightmare. His gamble worked. While the men he worked with were being fitted for nooses, Speer was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He used that time to write best-selling books, reinventing himself as the good Nazi. He was released in 1966 and lived a long, comfortable life as a celebrity historian. He died in 1981 of a stroke in a London hospital. It was a peaceful, quiet end, a luxury that millions of his victims never had the chance to experience.